I wanted to do a brief history for, as far as foundations of midwifery goes. And we were talking about the modern midwifery movement. That's what the question was about. And, we think about the influences of the modern midwifery movement. And I'm not sure where we're supposed to really start, right? Because we have the unconscious and the conscious influences, the ones that we acknowledge. And, it's the people who came before us. And maybe it's in the acknowledgement of these people that we get really confused about who we are as a midwifery culture. Sure, we can go back to to the people who came before us. I mean, what is that? And I think that within this modern midwifery culture, whatever that is, whether you identify as a traditional midwife, like in Minnesota, they have a whole, it's not just indigenous midwives who are traditional midwives. So it's an interesting term that you have traditional midwives who, I've always figured were indigenous midwives, but you also have traditional midwives who have a legal right to practice in a traditional way without using drugs or other things that they might carry with them. And somebody might want to correct me if I'm wrong about that. But that's how I see it, is going back to traditional skills. And we think about, where we are in this period of time, like, oh, well, who influenced a lot of people? And it was really the immigrant midwives, the indigenous midwives, the grand midwives. And what does being valued look like, or what are those things that have been passed on and taught, shared, received look like? And we can go back even further, and we can say that the first midwife was nature themselves, right? And nature herself was the first midwife. It's where we start learning about cycles, start learning about intervention, learning about death. Talk about something we don't really acknowledge here, right? And we can go to origin stories. Where did we come from? And that really influences how people birth, right? It's how they see nature, how they have their relationship with nature, how they see where they came from and what that means. And we can even go back to, we can look at some of our religious texts and see, whatever religion you're from, how birth was viewed, how the midwives were viewed, making their own decisions. And sometimes what gets left out is the in-between of different origin stories all around the world. You can go back to like Europe itself and think about the witch trials and how that arose. If you start looking at, Caliban the witch or other sources, you can really see that there's a large period of time where there's this transition from like feudalism to capitalism. And within this period of time, the community midwife, the village healer, no longer has a function that's useful for either the church or the state, because there's not a lot of control in it. And it's not like it wasn't valued, but it also, people were very wary of the power of these midwives. And it was with the unification of the church and the state that you found a purposeful campaign to have families turn against one another, right? purposeful campaign to have communities turn against themselves. So no longer could you trust even somebody within your old household. Who could you trust within your community? Everybody was out to get you, right? And it was just a lot of times the witch, right? Or the healer, or the person who knew about birth. And within the European culture, particularly, you could think about what the unconscious belief systems were of the time for survival. What did people say or learn or claim to know about birth? What did you choose to teach your children for them to stay alive, right? What did you choose for them to do so that they could avoid that violence? How were those belief systems possibly violent? And so, you know, these unconscious belief systems of not talking about certain things or knowing certain things or acknowledging them, and we see that here now within the culture here in the US, right? But we also see the effects of that because it was a very successful campaign where lots of people died or burned or whatever. But it was so successful that the same people who orchestrated it, put it into place, they exported it purposefully. They went ahead and exported it to the Americas, you know, to justify genocide. And they exported it to the Americas to justify enslavement of peoples. You know, we think about what that legacy is, even embodied, you know, what's that unconscious embodiment? Not just the belief systems that are left, because that's important, but also the embodiment of trauma. Resmaa Menakem really addresses this well in My Grandmother's Hands, because of course there's embodiment of trauma here in the US from the peoples who are affected. And are continued being affected. And you look at even the rise of midwifery from like a medical standpoint in the UK, you know, midwifery was there and was accepted. And so a lot of the midwives here in the US also trained with doctors who are doing home births. Or then you have, of course, the rise of the community midwife from a more nursing perspective, like Mary Breckenbridge and Frontier Nursing Program. And she had trained in the UK and really wanted to take that model here. Kind of this wild model of, yeah, we're going to serve poorer people in the Appalachians in Kentucky who are very Christian, right? And she really put forth that media image, and at the same time promoted the image of the Black community midwife, the grand midwives, started promoting them as being reckless or not clean. In fact, that same program and a lot of the CNM still played part in the licensure of the Shepherd-Townard Act, and how Shepherd-Townard Act was this act where there's money given for babies and birth. It could have just been children, and it was given to each state, and some of the states used it in different ways. And if you go down to the South, they used it to work with educating the grand midwives, right? And trying to teach them what they could do and what they could not do. If you've ever seen All My Babies, you know, this is kind of a documentation of a lot of what it looked like as far as some of those power dynamics. But you know, it was one of those things where licensure ended up eliminating midwifery. It no longer was affordable to practice midwifery. It was no longer easy to practice midwifery. It was no longer serving the community, but also in the power dynamic of being part of with the doctor. And it's not to mean that certain people didn't need to see the doctor or couldn't have been sent to the doctor, but that very licensure is what ended up eliminating midwives. And also taking away their traditional tools. And by eliminating, I meant like on the surface, because we know that people continue to practice on their own beyond that. And the midwives that came after this period of time, who learned from some of the grand midwives, they took that knowledge, those learnings, and there's not very much record of showing up for them when they were persecuted or told not to practice. Something similar that's happening right now in Mexico and other countries south of the US. It's happening here in some other ways, but it's not explicit. In Mexico, it's explicit that midwives, traditional midwives, are not supposed to practice. In fact, they're paid not to practice, right? They're threatened. And this is where, you know, the knowledge from those who came before us, we have to start naming it differently. Start thinking about restoration. And I know that I've learned much about the home birth movement of the 70s and 80s, and I appreciate the struggle there too, to practice regardless of persecution. There's a lot of trauma in midwifery, yeah, all the way back, a lot of trauma. And whether we start at, you know, genocide or enslavement or the witch trials or eliminating indigenous practices all over the world in all the continents, right? There's a lot of power in midwifery. How a culture births its babies says something about the culture. And who has the power to control that or learn from that says a lot as well. They reflect each other, right? It's dialectical. A lot of the midwives who were persecuted in the more recent strand of midwifery, regardless, were persecuted and were followed. And, you know, when people look back at licensure and its effects, some of the effects was less people being on trial or different people being on trial, right? But really less, because here in California, over 60 people were on trial when the license went through. There's a lot of great information about the history of California with Faith Gibson's website. I'd check it out. She has some great and thorough blogs on the subject that deserve a lot of attention to her lifetime work. You know, we hear about like this sense of disempowerment within the system of giving birth, where people just started to birth at home. And they birth at home on their own, and people have stories like that this happened, like droplets all across the United States, for instance, that people decided, I'm not going in there and I'm just going to do this myself. And then they told their friends and they told their friends. And soon enough, you had people like Maggie Bennett was talking about how they had a birth center, and it wasn't a birth center. You go birth, you go find out about how you go do your own birth, right? And they'd have their little kit of tinctures and things that they'd carry with them. And eventually they'd realize that if they had somebody with them who believed in them, that they would have more higher success of having a home birth, of not having to go in. And eventually these people who would accompany the families to sit with them and to help them, before you knew it, they're at 100 births, right? Or more. And they started to network with other people doing similar things. And they started to talk about complications. And this is when they learned from the people who learned from the people I mentioned before, how to deal with complications. Kind of like hands and knees from the Guatamalan midwives, or from the Belize midwife. What was her name? Oh, I'll have to put that in the comments. It's not coming to me. Anyways, just thinking about the conscious and the unconscious and what we're doing now. Our influences, what we're recognizing, that we know no matter what, that there's things we are. And how we start bringing that up and acknowledging it and dealing with that, that's part of where we start heading for restoration. Start doing some restoration work. Start changing some of the patterns where midwives can come together, right? It's a hard thing to do when you have so many different belief systems that are polarized, especially today. Thank you for listening.